This is Dr. Kathryn Dow reporting for Room Now. I'm at the ACR 2020 Convergence meeting, and I have three amazing guests today that I want to share with you. So these guests actually have been instrumental in developing the Global Rheumatology Alliance. And if you don't know what the Global Rheumatology Alliance is, it's actually a registry that's designed to collect data and analyze it and disseminate it about COVID-19 in our patients with rheumatic diseases. So first of all, we have Dr. Jinoos Yazdany. She's the chief of rheumatology at Zuckerberg in San Francisco General Hospital and also the Alice Betts Endowed Professor of Medicine at UCSF. And then we have Dr. Philip Robinson, who's the associate professor of the Royal Brisbane Clinical Unit. And then we have our beloved room cat, Dr. Jean Liew, assistant professor of the Boston University School of Medicine. Thank you so much for joining me today. So I wanted to first ask you all, how's the GRA doing now with their registry? How many patients' data have you collected and where are we at? Why don't we just start with you, Jinoos?
Thanks, Kathryn. Thanks for having us on. So, unfortunately, the pandemic just continues to rage in the US and in many other countries around the world, which is unfortunate, but that does mean that we're learning a lot about COVID-19. If you can believe it, we now have almost 7,000 patients that rheumatologists around the world have painstakingly recorded in the registry.
That's amazing. Have there been any surprises? Philip, we had interviewed you in the very beginning. Dr. Kush had talked to you about the GRA and some of the data that y'all have collected. Have you seen anything new that you wanted to share with our viewers?
Yeah, so there have been some surprises, certainly from my point of view, and I think things that have surprised other people. Drugs that we thought were pretty safe from a perspective of treating our rheumatic disease patients and infection. We saw that in fact potentially there are signals that they're not so safe. So one example would be from the inflammatory bowel disease cohort. They reported relatively early that there's potentially a signal with sulfasalazine. And we're presenting data later at the during the ACR that we've picked up that same signal. Now, clearly, this is in registry data, and it's going to need to be investigated further. But certainly, there have also sulfasalazines been picked up in other computational surveys as being interacting with the virus, and so, there's potentially multiple lines of data from a couple of registries and another source that, maybe there's an issue there, and that certainly needs to be delved into further.
That's great. And, also there's been several abstracts that the ACR have already reviewed and accepted from the GRA data. Some of them were in pregnancy, racial disparities, and also outcomes. Jean, do you have something to share about the data that you've seen?
So in terms of the abstracts that we have, so as a reminder, we've got our physician entered registry of patients with rheumatic disease who have had COVID-19. And we've looked at different outcomes among these cases. And then we also have our separate patient experience survey where patients can answer questions about their own experience during the pandemic, whether or not they've had a diagnosis of COVID-19. So through these two registries, we have abstracts that are being presented at this ACR. We have, as you said, our major outcomes. We have some pregnancy data, which are some case series, and we have racial and ethnic disparities in both the physician entered registry and in the patient experience survey. And then kind of in addition to that, we've also got two systematic lit reviews looking at our anti-rheumatic medications and either adverse viral outcomes or looking at the repurposing of these medications for the treatment of COVID-19 and what those data have been like to date.
So what surprised you the most with the data?
For me, so I I don't think anything has been super surprising. I think we have a lot of things that confirm what we knew, like that older age, people with more comorbidities, especially cardiovascular comorbidities, that these are associated with worse outcomes if they have COVID infection, and things like the race ethnicity disparities data that this just highlights something that we saw in the general population, that we're seeing it again among people with rheumatic disease. So it's more that it supports everything that we've seen rather than being surprising.
It is very dramatic, especially how the percentage of patients who are hospitalized were Latinx or Black patients. So yeah, I saw that as well as in socioeconomic classes. So do you think that this registry will morph? And I'm gonna let all three of you add your 2 cents, because I mean, like, you all have done so well, like collecting this data, but as we go further and further into this pandemic, there are just so many questions that I'm sure that you all had said, wow, I wish I'd collected that. And how is that gonna morph? Jinoos, you want to go ahead and take a stab?
No, I'd love to start. It's a great question. So I think, one of the things is when we think back to the early days, like just think, back to March, and we just had this huge, basically vacuum, right? We all just had no idea how this was going to affect our patients. Our patients were calling our offices, scared that, if they got COVID-19, that would just be the end, asking if they needed to stop their immunosuppressive therapy. And so, I think that the initial sort of drive for the registry was to just collect information as quickly as we could. We just needed some data. And, there was sort of less attention to making it, very, very systematic, or, a beautiful population-based epidemiologic study, right? But now, we have learned so much. We published the first paper with 100 patients, and then 600 patients. And now there's, a publication under review with almost 4,000 patients. And like I just said, there's 7,000 patients. So I think we've learned that actually most people with rheumatic disease or on immunosuppression are doing fine. Certainly there are some more severe outcomes, and there are some drugs that increase risk, like being on higher dose prednisone or being on some of our traditional immunosuppressants like mycophenolate or cyclophosphamide. But by and large, the outcomes are actually not that different than the general population. So I think that's been really reassuring. And it allows us to now think about the next phase, which I think is going to be characterized by more systematic data collection. So, we have these wonderful collaborators, both in the US and around the world, that are, going to the trouble of actually systematically collecting every single case that's seen within their catchment area. So, for example, our colleagues in the Boston hospitals, are doing this sort of universe data collection. Our colleagues at the Mayo Clinic are doing this. And then we have a small grants program for countries around the world that can do systematic data collection. So I think we're going to start to get more precision and just sort of a cleaner epidemiologic type study as the registry matures.
What about you, Philip? What's your wish list? What's going to happen to the registry?
Oh, look, again, that's a great question. And I think part of that is totally out of our hands in like what is going to happen with the pandemic, what is going to happen with vaccines. Is this going to be a durable, highly effective solution, or are we going to be left with a partially effective vaccine that provides some protection, but we're left with patients who are potentially in high-risk groups, maybe they're immunocompromised, maybe rheumatic disease patients who continue to be affected because, this disease may become endemic and the vaccine may not be highly effective. And in fact, even in patients who don't mount good responses, those with hypogamma or, other diseases, is this going to be a durable problem that we're going to continue having to worry about therapies? Or is this hopefully going to be largely fixed by a very effective vaccine or vaccines? So I think our role is really totally up in the air right now. We've clearly got a role now in what we're doing. And as Jinoos points out, we need to, think about how we can do this better now that we've got some reassuring initial data. But whether we're still thinking about outcomes of infection, or whether we starting to think about responses to vaccines and sort of have a bit of a frame shift towards vaccines and that sort of thing, I mean, it's totally up in the air, I think.
Right, right. And also the risk for recurrent infection, and whether or not patients who are on these biologics will respond as well, or you know, as methotrexate or disease modifying drugs, if they will have as a robust immune response. I mean, that's something that I worry about actually for my patient population. What about you, Jean? What do you think?
So I think as the pandemic keeps going on, we get more questions, and when I'm in clinic and I'm counseling my patients on starting a medication or changing them, I'm constantly using the information that we've learned from our registry and using that to inform clinical practice. But then there are always questions that patients have, that all these very valid concerns that we can't answer. And a lot of them are not questions that we would be able to answer anyway with the kind of data that we have. But then there are other questions that we could leverage, like parts of our structure or the many collaborations that we formed over these past many months to try to answer some of these other sort of offshoot questions as the pandemic goes on. And I think like now that we've like collaborated and worked together and have formed our sort of different groups of based on areas of interest, I think we could really tackle a lot of other questions as they come up. So like the vaccine one is a big one to talk about, but other things as well, like access to care, optimization for things like telemedicine, just things like that. So many questions regarding this pandemic.
The one thing I loved about the registry was that there was a physician enter side and a patient enter side, because what we see and what we experience isn't exactly what the patients are really experiencing. And so, and I love the idea of the collaboration, and just like what Dr. Gravelis had said in her opening lecture, was that we can't be a silo. We have to be collaborating with one another. So I really appreciate the time that you all took with me and for your insights into where we're at the GRA. Do you have any last words in terms of letting our viewers know where we're headed, and any last comments that you would like to add?
Just to thank everybody for their participation. I've never quite participated in anything like this before. I mean, this is really crowdsourced research with rheumatologists in countries around the world, all around the US, and all different types of practice settings participating. So just want to thank everybody, and also just encourage people to continue entering cases. We really do learn from every single case, and the quality of the data in this registry has just been phenomenal. To have like this esteemed group of rheumatologists, our community, entering, detailed clinical data, including like disease activity. It's been amazing.
Yeah, and I want to echo that too. I've been totally blown away by people's responses all around the world to spend huge amounts of time contributing to this. And, I just want to say thank you to everyone, and all the people that support them, and, all the patients that have contributed as well. We've had huge numbers of patients contribute their experiences and how they're going, and, all that. There's lots of work in progress that clearly people can't see, but there's so much stuff going on, and we are working very hard to get it disseminated.
And I hope that everyone who has questions or just wants to say hi or wants to contribute in some way, they either are able to meet with us at ACR or just communicate through all our various online channels, Twitter, our email, or our website. Just reach out with any questions or anything that you want to contribute to us. We would love to hear it.
Thank you all. Really appreciate it. And shout out for everybody who contributed. I actually enrolled a patient in the middle of the opening lecture.
Wow.
So, well, I hope you all have a good evening, and I appreciate you joining me again today. So Kathryn Dow signing off.